It has become the defining image of modern Latin America, migrants on the move. Setting off before dawn, some 4,000 migrants from Central America and the Caribbean spent weeks making slow progress across southern Mexico. Clutching their children as they walked, led by little but their faith, they'd come from all corners of the continent.
Guatemala is the fifth poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. About 60% of Guatemalans live in poverty. Most of them are indigenous. It also has the sixth highest rate of chronic malnutrition in the world. Almost half of children under the age of 5 here are malnourished. And while Guatemala remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world according to the State Department, it is poverty and lack of jobs that drive most of the people who seek to migrate to the United States.
I want to be clear to folks in this region, do not come.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
I've come to say bananas taste the best and are the best for you.
Does this look familiar? Ah, they've caught her eye. Bananas are a favorite breakfast fruit in every home. So you see, the young banana plant looks like a tree, but it is not a tree because there is no wood. The trunk or stalk consists only of overlapping leaf sheaths. And as you saw on the chart, each plant bears only a single bunch of bananas. Bananas are harvested the year round. The men usually work in teams of 3.
With 2% of the population owning 70% of the land, the United Fruit Company will become the largest landowner in Guatemala, owning 40% of the land.
The cutter uses a sharp-edged tool on the end of the pole to stick the plant between the clump of bunch. See how he does it? As for plant then, the bunch comes down on the shoulder of
The United Fruit Company would own all banana production in the region. They would also own all the railroad track, and having their own fleet of ships, they would also own all the docks and telephone poles.
The fruit must be cut at just the right.
The United Fruit Company was exempt from paying taxes and import duties under dictator George Obico, and almost 77% of all exports coming out of the country was going to the United States, profiting greatly but paying their workers extremely low wages. 99% of the population remained in poverty.
Ununiformed judicial police sent them out to quell the rioters and restore order. Guns were freely used. Tear gas bombs resulted in chaos. For the first 3 days, the students were alone in their protest. They fought the police with rocks and the weight of numbers. As the week progressed, adults joined the law.
Ruling with an iron fist. Freedom of the press would be eliminated, elections would be controlled, and any opposition suppressed. Indigenous people would be forced to labor plantations against their will, and hundreds of protesters and union organizers would be murdered. Brutal dictators like Manuel Esteban Cabrera, George Obico, Juan Federico Pons, regardless of the corruption, they would remain close allies to the United States and the United Fruit Company. After years of the Guatemalan military violently putting down protests, in 1944 a general strike by workers, students, teachers, and some progressive military officers would force the regime to have open elections. And by March 1945, Juan José Arevalo Bermejo would become Guatemala's first democratic president, ending years of dictatorship. Juan will reconstruct a new constitution which granted people basic civil rights and liberty.
gira de propaganda política del candidato de las fuerzas revolucionarias y progresistas de Guatemala, coronel Arbenz, prosigue con todo éxito. Estamos en la segunda ciudad del país en Quetzaltenango, que lo recibe jubiloso. Más de 20.000 partidarios del coronel Arbenz se congregan. El coronel Arbenz puntualiza en su discurso los aspectos más trascendentales de la vida nacional. Ofrece resolver el problema de la vivienda de los trabajadores, se refiere a la reforma agraria y a la justa retribución del trabajo. Con relación al capital extranjero, manifiesta que no se opondrá a él, en tanto que signifique progreso para el país y que no atente contra la soberanía nacional ni afecte derechos inalienables de Guatemala.
Although Guatemala now has democratic elections, the lives of the majority of the people remain pretty much the same. Hunger and poverty was still an everyday reality, and by 1951, a new president by the name of Jacobo Arbenz wanted change. Arbenz would see that many of the indigenous people were deprived of land ever since the Spanish conquest. Wanting to increase cultivation and equality, he soon realized that only 2% of the population owned 75% of the arable land, but only 12% of it was actually being used. So by June 17, 1952, Decree 900 will be signed into law. Current landowners will be compensated, but it called for 1,491,790 acres of unused farmland to be distributed to 100,000 families. Arbenz will gain mass popularity amongst unions and indigenous groups for this new law. It seemed like for a time actual change was coming.
Como corolario de este acto cívico de trascendental importancia para la vida política de Guatemala, el candidato de Unidad Nacional, coronel Arbenz, pronuncia conceptuoso discurso en el que enfoca realísticamente los múltiples problemas de las comunidades indígenas, de las unidades de producción y de la ciudadanía en general, proponiendo soluciones que tienen por base la reforma agraria democrática como fuente de prosperidad y bienestar para todos los guatemaltecos.
Guatemalans dared to challenge an American business that controlled much of its economy.
He might as well have declared war on the United States. In the Eisenhower administration, the Secretary and Undersecretary of State, the head of the CIA, and the UN ambassador all had ties to the United Fruit Company. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was a fanatical anti-communist who saw the Cold War as a biblical struggle between good and evil. Foster's brother, Allen Dulles, ran the CIA. It was a very convenient relationship, avoiding unnecessary debates about policy.
U.S. Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
But they had been subjected to the inflammatory influence of communism, which avowedly uses extreme nationalism as one of its tools.
After numerous requests by the Freedom of Information Act, on May 23, 1997, the American government would release documentation of its destabilization program in Guatemala.
Western Hemisphere. By 1954, under the presidency of Colonel Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, Guatemala was well on its way to becoming the first full-fledged member of the communist bloc on this side of the Atlantic.
Codenamed PB Success, the goal of the operation was to overthrow Guatemala's new democratically elected president, Arbenz, because of the new land reform that was required to buy back unused land from the United Fruit Company. The CIA operation will be granted $2.7 million budget for psychological and political action. This would include spreading propaganda that Arbenz was a communist, including training and arming a militia.
Edward Bernays was living in New York. In the 1920s, he had invented the profession of public relations and was now one of the most powerful PR men in America. He worked for most of the major corporations and advised politicians, including President Eisenhower. Like his uncle Sigmund, Bernays was convinced that human beings were driven by irrational forces. The only way to deal with the public was to connect with their unconscious desires and fears. Bernays argued that instead of trying to reduce people's fear of communism, one should actually encourage and manipulate the fear, but in such a way as it became a weapon in the Cold War. Rational argument was fruitless. One of Bernays' main clients was the giant United Fruit Company. They owned vast banana plantations in Guatemala in Central America. For decades, United Fruit had controlled the country through pliable dictators. It was known as a banana republic. But in 1950, a young officer, Colonel Arbenz, was elected president. And in 1953, he announced the government would take over much of their land. It was a massively popular move, but a disaster for United Fruit, and they turned to Bernays to help get rid of Arbenz.
United Fruit brings in Bernays, and he basically understood that what United Fruit Company had to do was change this from being a popularly elected government that was doing some things that were good for the people there into this being very close to the American shore, a threat to American democracy, that it being at a time in the Cold War when Americans responded to issues of the Red Scare and what communism might do, he was trying to transform this and brilliantly did transform it into an issue of a communist threat very close to our shores, taking United Fruit again as a commercial client out of the picture and making it look like a question of American democracy, American values being threatened.
In reality, Arbenz was a democratic socialist with no links to Moscow. But Bernays set out to turn him into a communist threat to America.
Fighting ends in Guatemala. These rebel troops, backed by air power, have compelled the ousting of Guatemala's pro-communist regime and have won a ceasefire from...
This is the story that most Americans heard. In fact, it was raw fiction, an imaginary revolution invented by the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower agreed to supply the rebels with American planes and pilots. When one pilot accidentally dropped a few bombs on neighboring Honduras, the CIA hastily wrote a cover story blaming the incident on the Arbenz government. Allen Dulles worried about the American press coverage. He wanted good reviews and no mention of any American role. Luckily for Dulles, United Fruit had been hard at work spinning the story. United Fruit hired Ed Bernays.
A CIA operation, codenamed PB Success, mobilized disaffected exiles and peasants into action.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, and terrify his troops.
One of the key operatives in this elaborate cover story was an ex-Marine named Phil Rettinger.
I was called over to the Latin American branch, and one of my friends was over there, and he said, "Say, we've got a job for you." And I said, "What are you talking about?" So we want you to take over the government of Guatemala. Of course, I've been hearing about this, but I said, "Well, what do you, this is out of my activity." He said, "Listen, you're a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, and you could do anything." You know that, don't you? Nobody in the government ever thought that Guatemala was any threat to the United States. What they were the threat to was the United Fruit Company. That's the only reason.
To create the illusion of a popular uprising against Arbenz, the CIA needed to find someone to lead the newly invented rebellion. The man they cast in the role was Castillo Armas. With a leader in place, it was up to Rettinger to train the rebel army. The troops mustered on a United Fruit plantation. On June 15, 1954, Eisenhower gave the Dulles brothers the go-ahead for the coup. 3 days later, the CIA brought Castillo Armas to the staging area.
We took him out to where the troops were, and I said, "Now, here they are. You lead them up there." But it was really a pitiful force that went up there. They had a hell of a time, of course. They ran into all kind of trouble.
At the very first sign of resistance from government forces, the rebel army turned tail and fled back to Honduras. Afraid the ragtag rebel army might be destroyed, the CIA ordered Castillo Armas to camp 6 miles inside the border and wait for further instructions. Meanwhile, at the UN, U.S. Ambassador and United Fruit stockholder Henry Cabot Lodge tried to put events into perspective.
Because it is certainly true that the United States has no connection whatever with what is taking place. The information available to the United States thus far strongly suggests that the situation does not involve aggression, but is a revolt of Guatemalans against Guatemalans.
The Castillo Armas forces would invade Guatemala on June 18, 1954. Backed by a heavy campaign of CIA psychological warfare, this would include a radio station which broadcasted anti-government propaganda and a version of false military events favorable to the rebellion. Claiming to be a genuine news, the false reports would claim air bombings of Guatemala City and a naval blockade. The Castillo regime fought poorly, and most of its offenses were defeated. However, psychological warfare and the fear of a U.S. invasion intimidated the Guatemalan military, which eventually refused to fight. Arbenz briefly attempted to arm civilians to resist the invasion, but was ultimately unsuccessful, and Arbenz would end up resigning on June 27, 1954. Castillo Armas became president 10 days later. The new regime would find Arbenz and force him to strip naked in public before he was allowed to leave the country. Arbenz and his family would spend the rest of their lives in exile, moving to country. Arbenz's daughter would commit suicide years later.
Todos sabemos cómo han bombardeado y ametrallado ciudades, inmolado a mujeres, niños, ancianos y elementos civiles indefensos. Todos conocemos la hazaña con que han asesinado a los representantes de los trabajadores y de los campesinos en las poblaciones que han ocupado, especialmente en Bananera, donde hicieron una expedición punitiva contra los representantes de los trabajadores. Lo de Bananera fue un acto de venganza de la frutera. Nos hemos indignado ante los ataques cobardes de los aviadores mercenarios norteamericanos que, sabiendo que Guatemala no cuenta con una fuerza aérea adecuada para rechazarlos, han tratado de sembrar el pánico en todo el país